Okay, we are on to chapter 9, muscles and muscle tissue. And you will certainly look at the anatomy of different muscles. Your work in lab is going to be looking at the origins, insertions, and actions of muscles on the human skeleton through pictures, unfortunately for now, and muscles that I modeled with clay to kind of show you the individual appearance and distribution of each muscle. But we also need to look at the physiology of muscle tissue and understand what happens at the microscopic level to enable muscles to contract. We just say, oh, my muscles contract. But what is really happening to make that contractibility a reality? So we're going to get into some muscle physiology now. All right, so we know that muscle tissue functions to create movement of the body, and we're really talking about skeletal muscle tissue now. So that is movements of parts of the body, like you can flex your forearm to move your forearm, or you can move your entire body through locomotion. Skeletal muscle tissue maintains your body's posture and your body's position. It really holds your skeleton together. It holds all those articulations together. If you took off the skeletal muscle, the skeleton would fall to the floor. And it stabilizes joints. And we talked in a prior lecture about that muscle tone, that tension due to the neural impulse that reaches the muscle cells that creates a tension that helps to keep joints stable, which means keep the articular surfaces in alignment. And when articular surfaces become disaligned, that's basically a dislocation, as you might be familiar with. All right, skeletal muscle tissue thermoregulates. That means that it is going to help you maintain a body temperature, and muscle tissue will do that by generating heat. Heat is a byproduct of skeletal muscle contraction, and therefore it thermoregulates in the direction of increasing body temperature. Remember, if you exercise, you're contracting a lot of skeletal muscles, you get really hot, and that's because of all the heat created by that muscle contraction. But then also if you're standing outside in the cold, not moving any skeletal muscles, you may have an involuntary skeletal muscle contraction called a shiver. And again, that's to try to generate some heat and warm your body up. And then muscle tissue also protects bones, as it is superficial to bones in most places on the body, and also protects internal organs where it acts as a cavity boundary. For example, all along the abdominal cavity, the walls forming that space are mostly layers of muscle, so they are protective. Okay, we know that muscle tissue has some unique properties that enable it to carry out those kinds of functions, especially the movement function. And those characteristics include something called excitability, also referred to as responsiveness. And this is the ability of a cell to receive and respond to stimulus by changing its membrane potential. And membrane potential is really the voltage across the plasma membrane, which of course is the outer part of a cell that holds everything inside. Voltage is really electrical potential energy. So we are going to be looking at the way that energy plays a role in creating muscle contraction and movement. And we'll be talking a lot about electrical energy as well as chemical energy, how we actually have to transform from electrical energy to chemical energy, which then goes back to electrical energy to kind of make this signal travel from the neuron, the nerve cell, to the muscle cell. And so the ability of a cell to do this, to take this electrical stimulus and use it to further the activity and the changes in a cell, is called excitability or responsiveness. Another special property of muscle tissue is contractibility or contractility, and we always think of muscles as contracting. So it's technically the ability to shorten forcibly when adequately stimulated. And this is a unique characteristic, that muscle cells shorten and then return to their normal size without any damage to the contents of the cell. That contractility will actually be what creates the movement for the cell on part of the body. Then we have extensibility, which is the ability to extend. You hear that in the word, just like you hear contract in contractility, to extend and stretch. So muscle cells have to be able to stretch beyond their resting length, even when they're at rest. And we'll look at this a little bit in lab. There's kind of an optimal size for the muscle cell to be to exert force on the body. If it's too short, if the cell is too short, it's not going to be as effective. If the cell is stretched too long, it's not going to be as effective. So we'll look at that a little bit with the muscle physiology. And then elasticity describes the ability of the cells to recoil and resume its resting length after stretching. So we know that muscle cells do change their shape, but then they return to that normal shape. And that's important because we want to be able to contract these muscles over and over and over again. So they need to be able to resume their original shape after that change of shape that occurred to allow for contraction. So these are some special properties of muscle tissue that allow it to do its job. Okay, so quick review of muscle tissue. 3 types of muscle tissue, and we are really going to focus on skeletal muscle here, but reviewing all 3 types. Skeletal muscle, we know, is voluntary. That means that we can willfully control it. We can use our brain and say, all right, I'm going to pick up the mouse next to my computer right now, and I can make the appropriate muscles do that to result in that behavior that I wanted, picking up the mouse. There are exceptions to skeletal muscle acting in a voluntary way. We described that shiver a few minutes ago, and that is an involuntary contraction of a skeletal muscle. So reflexes, when you touch a hot stove and you pull your hand back faster than you could even think about it, that's an involuntary skeletal muscle response. And then also your diaphragm, as you sit there listening to this lecture, your diaphragm is contracting and relaxing, and you're not willfully making it do that. It is acting in an involuntary way. You could voluntarily contract your diaphragm if you kind of bear down and sort of squeeze your abs, as you might do when you're defecating or when you're blowing out candles on a birthday cake. That would be a voluntary contraction of the diaphragm. So some skeletal muscles under certain circumstances have an involuntary action. And we see the picture here of skeletal muscle cells like we looked at under the microscope. Just a reminder, the individual cells are elongated or strip-like cells, and because of that shape, we sometimes call them fibers. So when we say a skeletal muscle fiber or muscle fiber, we're talking about one muscle cell. These cells are striated, so you see clear little lines cutting across the length of the cell, and those lines are due to the sarcomere, which we're going to talk about shortly. It's kind of the functional unit of an individual muscle cell, what causes it to contract. And then the individual cells are covered with a layer of loose connective tissue called an endomysium. Notice they're also multinucleated because during embryonic development, hundreds of smaller cells fuse together to make these muscle cells, which are really very, very long cells and very, very wide in diameter compared to typical cells. Skeletal muscle tissue has a bundled arrangement that we'll look at in more detail, but basically individual cells are bundled into groups called fascicles, which are bundled into a single muscle like biceps brachii. And then we know that skeletal muscles attach to parts of the skeleton at 2 points of attachment. One point is called the origin, and one point is called the insertion. And you're learning origins and insertions, hopefully through your lab work and through the lecture on muscles of the body. And we have a rule about that. Usually the insertion end is the end that will get pulled towards the origin end. So the insertion end is usually the end that moves, and the origin is usually the end that is stable. That is not always the case. There are exceptions. If you can stabilize the insertion end, then you're be able to pull on the origin end. And we'll get more on that in a minute. Okay, cardiac muscle, found of course in the heart. Looks a little bit different. It is involuntary. We definitely don't control the beating of our heart. And the cells are striated as well because of the microscopic arrangement of myofilaments but also branching. So they're not bundled, they're branching, and you can sort of see how one cell splits and attaches to more than one other cell. And the individual cells are also covered with connective tissue called endomysium. And these cells do have some special features. They are connected to each other at intercalated discs, which are sort of darker horizontal lines that you might be able to see where two cells connect in this picture. The intercalated discs are made up of gap junctions and desmosomes. Remember, those are protein cell junctions, ways that cells are held together to change permeability, for example, or to maintain the integrity of a tissue. So intercalated discs are unique to cardiac muscle. And it is found only in the myocardium of the heart, which is the middle layer of the heart wall, that is made up out of cardiac muscle. And the specific movement that this muscle creates is a pumping action of the heart wall that forces blood through the chambers of the heart and then generates enough blood pressure to move blood through the blood vessels of the body. Smooth muscle is involuntary, just like cardiac muscle is involuntary. You also do not control the contracting of your smooth muscle. And it's sometimes called visceral muscle because it's found within your organs, viscera for organs. These cells are just kind of stacked up on top of each other, forming sheets. They're super long and skinny. They kind of taper at the ends. That means they get pointy at the ends. And they do not have visible striations, which is why we call it smooth muscle. Individual cells are covered by that same kind of connective tissue, endomysium. And often organs will have two sheets of smooth muscle, and you're seeing the two sheets of smooth muscle in a typical hollow organ in this picture. And it's a cross section. So what we find is that one layer of smooth muscle will run around the length of the lumen, around the tube, and the other layer will run up and down the tube, elongated. And so when you take a cross section, you get two different views of the muscle cells, and you saw this in lab weeks ago. So we find smooth muscle in hollow organs like the stomach, the urinary tract, the digestive tract, as well as arteries and veins, blood vessels. We talked about the erector pili muscles, which were smooth muscle fibers that pulled on your hair follicles within the skin. And so they create different types of movement. Peristalsis, which is propulsion of the contents of a tube, pushing something through a tube. Expulsion, pushing something out of the body, or creating valves to regulate the passage of contents from one space to another. And constriction and dilation, so especially with blood vessels, we will make the lumen bigger or smaller, which in blood vessels helps to regulate your blood pressure. Okay, so back to skeletal muscle, which is really what we'll finish the lecture talking about. Skeletal muscle is made up mostly of skeletal muscle fibers or skeletal muscle cells. So when we're considering it as a tissue, there isn't a lot of extracellular material. Remember, connective tissue has tons of extracellular material, but muscle tissue does not. It's mostly cells, just like epithelial tissue was mostly cells. It is highly vascularized, so it will have a big blood supply. The arterial blood needs to bring a lot of oxygen because we'll see that oxygen is important for aerobic means of ATP production. And the venous supply is necessary for removing all of the metabolic wastes produced by the different reactions, for example, that provide that ATP. Skeletal muscle is also highly innervated, so lots of nerve endings going to your skeletal muscle, which again brings that excitability, that stimulus that's going to cause the changes that result in the muscle contracting. We said that there's connective tissue around each individual muscle cell, which is true. That's the endomysium. That's a loose connective tissue. But there are other connective tissue layers as well, connective tissue sheaths. Remember, a sheath is a covering. And these are continuous with each other, so they connect from one structural component to the next. And they're necessary for transmitting the pulling force all the way down to the bone. So where the muscle attaches to the bone, it will be connecting to the connective tissue layer of the muscle, to the connective tissue layer of the bone, which is of course the periosteum. And this kind of arrangement helps to prevent the muscle from sort of bursting or losing its structural integrity when it contracts. For example, we know when we flex our forearm and contract our biceps brachii, we get that big old giant muscle bulge that shows how strong we are. Well, the connective tissue layers help to keep the muscle intact even when it is kind of bulging out like that. So we have the 3 layers, and we already talked about the endomysium. That's the deepest layer, the areolar connective tissue around individual cells. And we said that those cells are bundled together into fascicles, and the connective tissue layer around a fascicle is called perimysium. Peri means around, and this is a dense irregular connective tissue, so a little bit stronger, certainly, than areolar connective tissue. And then a whole bunch of fascicles are going to be bound together with some blood vessels and nerves. And the connective tissue layer that is most superficial on a muscle is called epimysium. And that's also a dense, irregular connective tissue. That epimysium is what will connect to tendons if the muscle has an indirect attachment to a bone through a tendon, or connect directly to the bone, to the periosteum, if it is a direct connection between the muscle and the skeleton. So here's what that kind of looks like. They're doing that Chinese yo-yo sort of arrangement where they pull one segment out and pull the next segment out farther and farther and farther. So starting all the way on the left, you see the bone, that is the femur there. And this muscle is attached indirectly. So they're showing you a tendon, that's dense regular connective tissue, that is continuous with the epimysium. So that's the most superficial dense irregular connective tissue layer around the whole muscle. When you look at that muscle in cross-section like we're seeing, we see a whole bunch of kind of oval-shaped portions. Those are fascicles, and each fascicle has a perimysium around it, another connective tissue layer. And now we've pulled that fascicle out, and we see the cross-section of the fascicle, which shows us a whole bunch of muscle fibers. Remember, a muscle fiber is a muscle cell. And there's that endomysium, that loose connective tissue layer around the individual cells. And then they've pulled out one muscle cell for you to look at, and you start to get the understanding that one muscle cell is going to have a whole bunch of myofibrils in it. So you can see that one cell has a whole bunch of other little elongated, skinny things, and we're going to talk about those. Those are your myofibrils. All right, so as we mentioned, skeletal muscles attach through 2 points on the body. One is called the origin, one is called the insertion. And as I mentioned, it's the origin end that is usually steady and stable and does not move, and the insertion end that usually does move. And we have a couple of rules for helping to identify which attachment of the muscle is the origin and which one is the insertion. And these are really helpful when you're studying those muscle pictures. When you look at muscles modeled on little skeletons, it's helpful to remember these little rules. So if you're looking at a muscle on the thorax, like pectoralis major or trapezius or latissimus dorsi, the origin is going to be the more medial attachment and the insertion the more lateral attachment. So medial, of course, means near the midline, and lateral away from the midline or towards the side. So that's usually pretty clear on those thoracic muscles. Origin is medial, like for pectoralis major, the origin is the sternum, costal cartilages 1 through 6, and the medial clavicle, and the insertion is in the intertubercular groove of the humerus. So that's clearly medial origin, lateral insertion. On the appendages, on the upper extremity and the lower extremity, the rule changes. Now the origin is going to be the more proximal attachment, and the insertion the more distal attachment. Proximal, we know, means closer to the origin of the appendage, which is at the girdle. So the shoulder for the upper extremity, the hip for the lower extremity, and the insertion will be more distal to that. And if you think about our rule that insertion is usually the end that moves, that makes good sense. It's going to be really hard to pull your shoulder towards your fingers because the weight of the body is running right through the midline of the body, through that axial skeleton. But it's going to be much easier to move a distal part of an appendage towards that stabilized axial skeleton, which is where the girdle is, the more proximal part is. Sometimes the insertion end can move if we can stabilize it. The origin end can move if we can stabilize the insertion. So a couple of ways to do that: through the weight of the body. For example, if you stand on one lower extremity, you can flex your other thigh with a muscle called iliopsoas. However, if you're standing on both lower extremities and you try to contract your iliopsoas, the weight of the body is stabilizing your thigh, and the origin end, which is attached to your trunk, will move instead. So that iliopsoas muscle can flex the thigh without the weight of your body on it, and can flex the trunk with the weight of your body on it. So weight can secure an insertion end and help you move the origin end. Also, other muscles can act as what we call fixators, that is holding the bone in place, and that again is stabilizing the insertion and allowing the origin end to be moved. Okay, so as I've been mentioning, skeletal muscles can attach directly or indirectly to the skeleton. Direct attachment is also considered a fleshy attachment, and that means that the skeletal muscle fibers through their epimysium are attaching directly to the periosteum of a bone, or if their connection is to cartilage, directly to the perichondrium. And that's what you see here with these little interosseous muscles of the hand. You notice the skeletal muscle fibers go straight to those metacarpals. And that's the origin end for those muscles. An indirect attachment is through a tendon or something called an aponeurosis, some kind of connective tissue. And for example, the epimysium extending beyond a muscle as a tendon or aponeurosis will then attach to the periosteum or perichondrium. So we still have those connective tissue components holding together to make the connection between the bone and the muscle. But if it's the connective tissue of a tendon, that's different than if it's the connective tissue directly of the epimysium. Some muscles attach directly to skin. That would also be an indirect attachment. And those are really your muscles of facial expression, because as we know, we can't move any of the synarthroses of our skull. All those sutures are synarthroses, they don't move. So a skeletal muscle running across a suture can contract, but it's not going to move anything because there's no mobility at a suture. So the muscles of facial expression have their origin on the bones of the skull, but insert into the soft tissue of the skin, and they pull on the skin, and that changes the expression on your face. Indirect attachments are more common in the body and more durable. So there's a lot of pull. Every time a skeletal muscle pulls, it rubs up against the bone, and tendons are able to withstand that abrasion much better. And a lot of the features that you learned on the bones in lab, the tubercles and the trochanters, the tuberosities, those are all places of indirect muscle attachments that have been affected by the multiple pulling on that particular part of the bone by a muscle. Okay, so we're going to stop here for a moment, and we'll resume the lecture in a bit.